The Honda Civic was parked in the back corner of the Georgia State University Library parking deck on a Tuesday night in February when Marcus Williams woke at 2:47 a.m. to the sound of campus security tapping on the window. He was 22 years old, a senior majoring in computer science, and he had been sleeping in his car for 7 months since the foster care stipend that had covered his dorm room expired when he turned 21. The officer shined a flashlight through the window at Marcus, who sat up slowly from where he had been sleeping across the back seat, his textbooks and laptop creating an uncomfortable lumpy surface beneath the sleeping bag he had bought at Goodwill for $12. Marcus rolled down the window, his breath visible in the cold air, and the officer looked at him with an expression that combined annoyance and something that might have been recognition or pity. The officer was a black man himself, maybe in his 40s, and he studied Marcus's face for a long moment before speaking. "You can't sleep here. This is university property. You need to move along." Marcus nodded, started the car to demonstrate compliance, and waited for the officer to leave before he pulled out of the parking deck and drove to the Walmart 3 miles away, where the parking lot was large enough and busy enough that his car would not stand out among the RVs and trucks, whose drivers also used the lot as overnight parking. He would sleep there for a few hours, wake at 6 to use the gym facilities at the university, where his student ID still granted him access, shower and dress for his morning classes, and begin another day of the careful choreography required to be homeless while appearing to be a normal college student. The homelessness was not something Marcus discussed with his classmates or his professors, was not something he disclosed in the tutoring sessions where he earned $12 an hour helping freshmen understand basic programming concepts, was not something visible in his academic performance, which remained strong despite the logistical challenges of studying without reliable housing. He had learned early in life, first in the succession of foster homes that had defined his childhood, and then in the group home where he lived from 15 to 18, that vulnerability invited exploitation or pity or both, that the safest strategy was to appear capable and self-sufficient, regardless of actual circumstances. Marcus had aged out of foster care at 18, with a partial scholarship to Georgia State, enough to cover tuition but not housing or food or books or the 1,000 other expenses that college required. He had worked 2 jobs during his first 3 years, stocking shelves at a grocery store and doing IT support for small businesses, living in the cheapest dorm room available, and eating ramen and whatever free food appeared at campus events. But when he turned 21, the state support that had supplemented his income disappeared, and the financial calculation that had been barely sustainable became impossible. He had tried to find affordable housing, had looked at apartments in neighborhoods where white students would never consider living, had inquired about rooms in houses shared by 5 or 6 people, had calculated and recalculated his budget, trying to make the numbers work. But even the cheapest options required deposits and first month's rent that Marcus did not have, required proof of income that exceeded what he earned, required credit histories that people who aged out of foster care rarely possessed. So he had made the choice that seemed rational given his options, which was to sleep in his car and use the money he saved on rent to ensure he could pay tuition and buy the computer equipment he needed for his classes. The decision was temporary, Marcus told himself, just until graduation in 3 months, just until he could get a full-time job with a technology company and earn the kind of salary that would make housing affordable. Just until he crossed the finish line of the college degree that was supposed to be his pathway out of poverty and into the stability that people called the middle class. What Marcus was building during those months of car dwelling, though he did not yet know it, was not just a computer science degree, but also a software application that would eventually become the foundation of a technology company worth more than $500 million. The application started as a class project, a tool for helping students find and share information about campus resources, but Marcus had continued developing it beyond the assignment requirements because the problem it addressed was one he understood intimately. Students needed to know where to find food banks and emergency housing assistance and mental health services and job opportunities, needed to navigate university bureaucracies that were opaque and intimidating, needed information that was currently scattered across dozens of websites and offices and informal networks. Marcus built the application using technologies he had taught himself, working late at night in the library or in his car when the library closed, testing features with other students who had no idea that the developer sleeping in the parking deck was the one building the tool they found increasingly useful. The application was called Pathways, and within 6 months of its initial campus launch, 3,000 Georgia State students were using it regularly, relying on it to navigate everything from financial aid applications to career counseling to emergency assistance. Stories like Marcus Williams's, accounts of individuals navigating poverty and homelessness while pursuing education and building the foundations for future success, deserve circulation beyond the inspirational narratives that flatten them into simple tales of perseverance. If this chronicle resonates with you, if you recognize in it patterns of systemic inequality that make success unnecessarily difficult for people without family wealth or support structures, consider the importance of sharing these accounts with others who need to understand that individual achievement does not erase structural injustice. Marcus graduated from Georgia State in May with a 3.7 GPA and a degree in computer science, and he moved his few possessions from his car into a tiny studio apartment in East Atlanta that he could finally afford because he had accepted a job offer from a mid-sized technology company called Integrated Systems Solutions. The job paid $58,000 a year, more money than Marcus had ever imagined earning, enough to cover rent and food and car insurance and the student loan payments that would begin 6 months after graduation. The position was as a junior software developer, writing code for enterprise clients, and it represented the stability and security that Marcus had been working toward for 4 years. But even as he started the job, spending his days in a cubicle writing database queries and attending meetings about project timelines, Marcus continued developing Pathways. The application had expanded beyond Georgia State, with students at Georgia Tech and Emory requesting access, and Marcus had begun to envision how it could scale to universities across the country. The technical challenges were significant but solvable. The more difficult questions were about business model and funding, and whether something that had started as a tool to help students like himself could become a sustainable company. Marcus spent his evenings and weekends working on Pathways, building out features and expanding the user base, and beginning to research what it would take to turn the application into an actual business. He read articles about startup funding and venture capital, about pitching investors, and building minimum viable products and achieving product-market fit. The world of entrepreneurship was foreign to him, seemed to require networks and knowledge and resources that people from his background rarely accessed, but Marcus had taught himself programming and had navigated college while homeless, and he approached learning about startups with the same determination. The challenge was that most advice about starting a technology company assumed certain baseline resources. It assumed you could quit your job and work full-time on your startup, assuming you had savings to live on or family support to fall back on. It assumed you had connections to potential investors, assuming you had attended the right schools or worked at the right companies or grew up in the right social networks. It assumed you understood the cultural codes of entrepreneurship, assuming you had been exposed to that world through family or friends or previous employment. Marcus had none of these assumptions. He could not quit his job because he needed the income and the health insurance and the stability. He had no connections to investors, had never met anyone who had started a successful company, had no network beyond the other students and foster care alumni he knew who were struggling with similar challenges, and he did not understand many of the cultural codes, did not know that startup founders were expected to project confidence even when uncertain, to describe modest traction as explosive growth, to network aggressively at events where the dress code and social dynamics were designed to exclude people who looked like him or came from his background. But Marcus had one significant advantage, which was that Pathways was actually working, was solving real problems for thousands of students, was growing organically without marketing or advertising budget. The usage data was compelling, showed high engagement and retention, demonstrated that students found the application genuinely useful rather than just novel. And the problem it solved, helping students navigate college resources and bureaucracies, was one that existed at virtually every university in the country. Marcus decided to apply to a startup accelerator, a program that provided seed funding and mentorship and connections to investors in exchange for equity in the company. He researched accelerators extensively, reading about acceptance rates and portfolio companies and success stories, and he settled on applying to TechLaunch, a well-regarded program based in Atlanta that focused on early-stage technology startups. The application required describing the business, demonstrating traction, explaining the market opportunity, and articulating why the team was capable of executing on the vision. The application took Marcus 3 weeks to complete, working after his job at Integrated Systems, and on weekends, writing and rewriting the responses to make them as compelling as possible while remaining honest about the current state of the business. He submitted the application in October, 8 months after graduation, and tried not to think about it too much while waiting for a response. The acceptance rate for TechLaunch was less than 3%, and Marcus had no reason to believe his odds were better than anyone else's. The email arrived 6 weeks later, inviting him to interview with the Accelerator's selection committee. Marcus took a vacation day from his job, bought a shirt and tie at Target, and drove to TechLaunch's office in Midtown Atlanta for the 30-minute interview. The selection committee consisted of 4 people, 3 white men and 1 white woman, all of them wearing the casual clothing that signaled success in technology, and they asked Marcus questions about his business model and his user growth and his plans for scaling. Marcus answered as clearly as he could, presenting the data about usage and retention, explaining the revenue model he envisioned based on partnerships with universities and subscriptions from students, acknowledging the challenges around monetization while emphasizing the value the application provided. The committee members took notes and asked follow-up questions, and Marcus could not tell whether they were impressed or skeptical or simply going through the motions of due diligence. At the end of the interview, one of the committee members, a man named David Richardson, who had founded and sold 2 previous startups, asked a question that Marcus had not anticipated. "Tell us about your background. Where did you grow up? What's your story?" It was framed as an open-ended inquiry, but Marcus understood that the question was really asking about his credentials, about whether his background conformed to the pattern of successful founders. He made a decision in the moment to be honest rather than strategic, to provide the actual answer rather than the polished narrative he might have constructed. "I grew up in foster care in Atlanta. Multiple placements, aged out of the system at 18. I put myself through Georgia State, slept in my car for the last several months because I couldn't afford housing after the foster care support ended. Built Pathways while I was homeless because I needed tools like it to survive college. Now I'm working a full-time job at a software company and developing Pathways nights and weekends because I believe it can help thousands of other students who are navigating college without family support or resources." The room was quiet for a moment after Marcus finished speaking, and he could not read the committee members' expressions, could not determine whether his honesty had been a mistake. Then David Richardson nodded slowly and said, "That's exactly the kind of founder grit we look for. Thank you for sharing that." Marcus was accepted into TechLaunch 3 weeks later, offered $25,000 in seed funding and 3 months in the Accelerator program in exchange for 7% equity in Pathways. The offer was standard for the program, but it represented a validation that Marcus had not expected, a signal from people who understood the technology industry that his idea had merit and that he had the potential to build something significant. Accepting the Accelerator offer meant making difficult choices about his full-time job. The TechLaunch program was intensive, required attendance at workshops and mentor meetings and pitch practices during business hours, was not compatible with maintaining a 40-hour-per-week employment commitment. Marcus talked to his manager at Integrated Systems, explained the situation, and asked whether it would be possible to transition to part-time or contract work for 3 months while he participated in the Accelerator. The manager was a white man in his 50s named Robert Chen, and his response revealed the limitations of institutional flexibility. "I appreciate you being upfront about this, Marcus, but the position requires full-time commitment. If you want to pursue the startup, you'll need to resign. We can't hold the position for you, and we can't create a part-time arrangement that doesn't exist in our structure." It was not hostile, not discriminatory in any obvious way, but it was a barrier that someone with family wealth or a partner's income might navigate easily, while Marcus faced it as a potentially catastrophic risk. If the startup failed, if he could not raise additional funding after the Accelerator, if Pathways did not generate revenue quickly enough, he would be unemployed without savings or family support to fall back on. The rational choice was to decline the Accelerator, keep the stable job, continue developing Pathways on the side until it was generating enough revenue to justify leaving employment. But Marcus had not made rational choices defined by risk avoidance throughout his life. If he had, he would not have gone to college, would not have slept in his car to finish his degree, would not have spent thousands of hours building an application without any guarantee of return. The rational choice for someone in his position was to accept limited options and limited possibilities, to be grateful for stability rather than pursuing growth. Marcus gave his 2 weeks' notice at Integrated Systems Solutions and joined TechLaunch's cohort in January, 12 months after graduating from college. He was one of 8 founders accepted into the program, and he was the only black founder, the only founder who had grown up in foster care, the only founder who had ever been homeless. The other founders came from different backgrounds. Some had worked at major technology companies like Google or Microsoft. Some had business degrees from prestigious universities. Some had founded previous companies that had failed but had generated connections and lessons that made them credible to investors. The 3 months in the accelerator were transformative for Marcus, not just in terms of business development, but in terms of understanding how the technology industry actually operated. The workshops covered everything from customer acquisition to pricing strategy to term sheet negotiation, and the mentors who worked with the cohort provided insights that Marcus would never have accessed on his own. But the experience also revealed to Marcus how much his background differed from the typical founders, how many assumptions about resources and networks and social capital were embedded in standard advice about building startups. The advice about networking, for instance, assumed that founders would attend industry events and conferences, would join professional organizations and alumni groups, would build relationships through shared elite credentials. But these activities required time and money that Marcus did not have, required comfort in social environments where he often felt like he did not belong, required the kind of confidence that came from growing up in environments where you were assumed to deserve opportunities, rather than constantly proving you deserve to exist in the space. The advice about fundraising assumed that founders would leverage personal networks to get introductions to venture capitalists, would use warm introductions from trusted sources rather than cold outreach, would be able to access capital through relationships their families or former employers had cultivated. But Marcus had no such networks, knew no one who knew venture capitalists, would need to approach fundraising through the much more difficult path of cold email and demo days and competition pitches. And the advice about scaling assumed that founders would hire quickly, would bring on experienced operators and engineers and salespeople, would build teams that could execute fast. But hiring required capital that Marcus did not yet have, required being able to assess talent and culture, fit in ways that people who had never worked in functional startups struggled with, required projecting authority and vision that investors expected from founders, but that often felt performative to someone like Marcus, who had spent his life learning to be invisible rather than commanding attention. The accelerator culminated in Demo Day, an event where each founder pitched their company to a room full of investors, potential customers, and technology industry professionals. Marcus had practiced his pitch dozens of times, refining the narrative about pathways, presenting the traction data and the business model and the vision for becoming the platform that helped students navigate higher education. He spoke clearly and confidently, and the pitch was well received, generating applause and follow-up inquiries from several investors. But the follow-up process revealed new barriers. The investors who expressed interest wanted to meet for coffee, wanted to be walked through the financials in detail, wanted to discuss team composition and market strategy and competitive landscape. These meetings were testing Marcus's ability to perform the role of CEO, to demonstrate that he had the knowledge and sophistication and strategic thinking that investors expected from founders they backed. And Marcus was aware in every meeting that he was being evaluated not just on the merits of pathways, but on whether he fit the pattern of successful founders that investors had learned to recognize. The pattern was overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly from elite educational institutions or successful technology companies. The pattern assumed certain speech patterns and cultural references and social styles that Marcus had not grown up with and did not naturally embody. Some investors were explicit about their concerns. One venture capitalist, a white man named Christopher Wells from a firm called Catalyst Ventures, told Marcus directly that while Pathways had impressive traction, he worried about Marcus's lack of business experience, his limited network, his absence of previous startup exposure. "You're a talented engineer," Christopher said, his tone suggesting this was meant to be encouraging. "But building a company requires skills beyond just building a product. Have you thought about bringing on a more experienced co-founder? Someone with business development background, someone who has done this before?" The suggestion was framed as helpful advice, but Marcus understood the subtext, which was that Christopher did not believe Marcus was capable of leading the company himself, that investors wanted someone who fit their template for fundable founders, and Marcus did not fit that template. The recommendation to bring on a co-founder was common advice that many founders received, but for black founders it often carried a specific implication, which was that they needed adult supervision, that their own capabilities were insufficient regardless of their track record. Marcus responded carefully, acknowledging the value of experienced leadership, while also defending his own capabilities and his intimate understanding of the problem Pathways solved. But he left the meeting understanding that Catalyst Ventures would not be investing, that Christopher's concerns were not really about experience, but about comfort and pattern matching and the implicit biases that shaped investment decisions, even when investors insisted they were evaluating founders objectively. Other investors passed for different stated reasons. The market was too small, too niche, focused only on college students rather than a broader demographic. The business model was unclear, too dependent on universities adopting the platform, too slow to generate revenue. The competitive landscape was crowded, with established players and well-funded startups addressing adjacent problems. Each rejection came with explanations that sounded reasonable, that might have been the actual reasons, or might have been convenient rationalizations for decisions shaped by pattern matching and bias. Marcus met with 23 investors over the 3 months following demo day, and 21 of them declined to invest. The 2 who were interested offered term sheets with valuations, and terms that Marcus's mentors told him were unfavorable, that undervalued the company and gave investors too much control, that would make raising future rounds difficult, and would dilute Marcus's ownership to levels that would not provide meaningful financial return, even if the company succeeded. The fundraising process was exhausting and demoralizing in ways that were difficult to articulate to people who had not experienced it. Each pitch required hours of preparation. Each meeting required projecting confidence and vision while being questioned about every aspect of the business. Each rejection required processing the disappointment and moving forward without becoming visibly discouraged. And underlying all of it was the awareness that Marcus was fighting not just to prove that Pathways was a good investment, but to overcome assumptions about who could successfully build technology companies. If you have been following Marcus Williams's journey and recognizing in it patterns that extend beyond his individual circumstances, patterns of how venture capital systematically excludes founders who do not fit narrow demographic profiles regardless of their company's traction or potential, consider the importance of ensuring that accounts like this reach audiences beyond those already convinced of their validity. The work of changing these systems requires collective recognition that they are systems rather than collections of individual decisions. By August, 6 months after Demo Day, Marcus had burned through most of the $25,000 from tech launch and had not secured additional investment. He was facing the prospect of shutting down Pathways or of trying to grow it through revenue alone, bootstrapping without the capital that venture-backed competitors had to spend on marketing and hiring and rapid scaling. The revenue from university partnerships was modest, a few $1,000s per month, enough to cover server costs but not enough to pay himself a salary or to hire additional help. Marcus made the decision to bootstrap, to focus on revenue generation rather than fundraising, to grow more slowly but sustainably without venture capital. It was not the typical path for consumer technology companies, which usually required significant capital to achieve the scale necessary for success. But it was the path available to Marcus given his circumstances, and it had the advantage of allowing him to maintain ownership and control rather than diluting his equity to investors who did not believe in his capabilities. He rebuilt his consulting practice, taking contract software development work to generate income while continuing to develop Pathways on the side. The work was similar to what he had done before the accelerator, was a return to the hustle and the long hours and the constant juggling of competing demands on his time. But Marcus had learned from the accelerator experience had developed business skills and strategic thinking and network connections that made him more effective than he had been before. And Pathways continued growing, slowly but steadily, adding universities through word of mouth and organic growth, expanding features based on user feedback, building a reputation as the most comprehensive platform for student resource navigation. Marcus charged universities modest annual fees for institutional licenses, typically $5,000 to $10,000, depending on enrollment size, and he reinvested every dollar of revenue back into the platform, improving infrastructure and adding capabilities and gradually building a sustainable business. 2 years after the accelerator, Pathways was being used at 37 universities across 12 states, was generating $300,000 in annual revenue, and was profitable enough that Marcus could pay himself a modest salary and hire a part-time designer and a part-time customer success person. The growth was not explosive, would never be featured in TechCrunch articles about rapidly scaling startups, but it was real and sustainable and built on actual value provided to users rather than on hype or venture capital spending. Marcus was 27 years old, living in a modest apartment in Atlanta, driving the same Honda Civic he had slept in during college, saving money carefully and living frugally because he knew that financial instability could return at any moment. He had not forgotten what it felt like to be homeless, to have no safety net, to be one emergency away from catastrophe. The business success he was building felt tenuous, felt like it could evaporate through bad luck or market changes or competitor actions, and Marcus was reluctant to make financial commitments that assumed stability would continue. But the business was working, was solving problems that mattered, was helping students navigate college who might otherwise have struggled or dropped out. Marcus received emails regularly from students who told him that Pathways had connected them with emergency housing assistance or food banks or mental health services or job opportunities, that the platform had made college survivable when they were on the edge of giving up. The emails were the most meaningful measure of success, more important than revenue numbers or user counts, validation that the work he was doing had value beyond just building a profitable company. The turning point came unexpectedly, through a connection that Marcus had not anticipated. One of the universities using Pathways was the University of Michigan, and a professor there named Dr. Janet Morrison had been researching student retention and success factors. She had discovered through her research that students who used Pathways regularly had significantly higher retention rates and graduation rates than comparable students who did not use the platform. The correlation was strong enough that Dr. Morrison published a paper about it in a higher education journal, describing Pathways as an example of how technology could address structural barriers to student success. The paper caught the attention of educational technology investors and philanthropy organizations focused on college access and completion. Marcus started receiving inquiries from venture capital firms and private equity funds that specialized in education technology, investors who understood the higher education market and who could see the potential for Pathways to scale nationally. These investors were different from the general technology VCs Marcus had pitched after Demo Day, were more focused on business fundamentals and actual traction rather than on pattern matching and founder credentials. One firm in particular, called Ascent Capital Partners, reached out with serious interest. The partner leading the inquiry was a black woman named Simone Jenkins, who had spent 15 years in education policy before moving into impact investing. Simone understood both the problem Pathways addressed and the barriers Marcus had faced in fundraising, and her approach was collaborative rather than evaluative, treating Marcus as a peer with valuable expertise rather than as someone who needed to prove his worthiness. The conversations with Ascent Capital were different from Marcus's previous investor meetings, felt less like interrogations and more like strategic planning sessions. Simone asked about Marcus's vision for the company, about what resources would enable faster growth, about what values and priorities would guide decision-making as the company scaled. She was direct about challenges and risks, but she was also clearly enthusiastic about the opportunity and about Marcus's capabilities. Ascent Capital offered a term sheet in November, 3 years after Marcus had left TechLaunch, proposing a $5 million Series A investment at a $20 million pre-money valuation. The terms were favorable, allowed Marcus to maintain majority ownership, included provisions for impact measurement alongside financial returns, and came with strategic support from a Sense network of education technology advisors and higher education leaders. Marcus spent 2 weeks reviewing the term sheet with a lawyer he hired specifically for this purpose, making sure he understood every clause and implication, making sure the terms aligned with his goals for the company. The valuation was lower than venture-backed competitors were receiving, but it was fair given Pathway's current revenue and growth rate, and it provided enough capital to hire a team and invest in sales and marketing and scale much faster than bootstrapping alone would allow. He accepted the offer, and the funding closed in December. Marcus used the capital strategically, hiring a head of sales with experience in the education technology market, bringing on 3 engineers to accelerate product development, investing in marketing focused on university administrators and student success professionals who made purchasing decisions. The team was small and focused, 7 people total including Marcus, but they were all experienced and aligned on the mission of helping students succeed in college. The growth that followed was significant, but not explosive. Pathways added 50 universities in the year after the Series A, growing from 37 institutions to 87, and revenue increased from $300,000 to $2.1 million. The growth was driven by demonstrated impact, by the retention data that Dr. Morrison's research had surfaced, by word of mouth among university administrators who saw colleagues achieving better student outcomes by implementing Pathways. By the time Marcus was 30, 5 years after graduating from college, Pathways was at 200 universities, was generating $10 million in annual revenue, and was approaching profitability despite the increased operating costs that came with a larger team. The company had grown to 40 employees, had opened a proper office in Atlanta, had developed a reputation in higher education circles as the leading platform for student resource navigation and success support. But the growth also brought new challenges around maintaining culture and values as the organization scaled. Marcus had built Pathways with a specific mission, had always prioritized serving students who were struggling and marginalized, had designed features and pricing models with accessibility in mind. As the company grew and added employees who had not lived the experiences that motivated Marcus, as investors and board members pushed for faster growth and higher margins, there was tension between mission and financial optimization. Some of the tension manifested in hiring decisions. Marcus wanted to hire people who had experienced the challenges Pathways addressed, who understood intimately what it meant to navigate college without resources or support, who brought lived experience alongside professional credentials. But some board members and executives argued that hiring should prioritize traditional qualifications and experience, that the company needed senior talent from established education technology companies, that mission alignment was secondary to skills and track record. Marcus pushed back, insisting that diversity of experience and perspective was essential to building products that actually served marginalized students, that hiring only people with elite credentials would reproduce the very systems Pathways was trying to challenge. He implemented hiring practices that included evaluating candidates' understanding of educational equity alongside their technical or business skills, that considered non-traditional career paths as valuable as prestigious previous employers, that explicitly recruited from communities underrepresented in technology. The practices were not universally popular, generated complaints from some candidates and recruiters who thought Marcus was prioritizing identity over merit, who argued that the best person for each job should be hired regardless of background. Marcus had to repeatedly articulate that merit was not neutral, that evaluations of who was best were shaped by biased assumptions about what credentials and experiences mattered, that building a company capable of serving diverse students required a team with diverse experiences and perspectives. Another source of tension was pricing and accessibility. Marcus had always believed that Pathways should be accessible to resource-constrained institutions, that the platform should not only be available to wealthy universities that could afford high licensing fees. He had implemented a sliding-scale pricing model where smaller and less wealthy institutions paid significantly less than large research universities, where community colleges paid a fraction of what private universities paid. Some investors and board members questioned this approach, argued that Marcus was leaving money on the table, that Pathways should charge market rates regardless of institutional wealth, that the company's financial returns should not be constrained by values-driven pricing. The arguments were framed as business pragmatism, as maximizing shareholder value, as ensuring the company could achieve the scale necessary for lasting impact. Marcus understood the logic, but rejected the conclusion. He articulated clearly that pathways existed to serve students who were struggling, that those students were disproportionately at under-resourced institutions, that pricing the platform out of reach of community colleges and regional public universities would undermine the entire mission. He was willing to grow more slowly if that meant remaining accessible to the institutions that most needed the platform. The tension came to a head when Marcus was approached by a major private equity firm about acquiring Pathways. The offer was substantial, $200 million for full ownership, a multiple of current revenue that would make Marcus and the investors wealthy, and that would allow the acquirer to fold Pathways into their portfolio of education technology companies. The private equity firm had a reputation for aggressive cost optimization and price increases, for maximizing profitability sometimes at the expense of quality or mission, but they also had distribution capabilities that could bring Pathways to thousands of additional institutions. Marcus spent several sleepless nights considering the offer, thinking about what it would mean to accept versus to decline. Accepting would resolve his own financial security permanently, would make him wealthy beyond anything he had imagined possible growing up in foster care, would validate all the years of struggle and sacrifice. But it would also mean losing control of Pathways, would mean trusting that the acquirer would maintain the mission and values that had guided the company's development, would mean stepping away from the work that had been central to his identity and purpose. He declined the acquisition offer, a decision that surprised some investors and board members who could not understand why someone from Marcus's background would turn down life-changing money. But Marcus was clear about his reasoning. He had not built Pathways to become wealthy. He had built it to solve a problem he had experienced personally, to help students who were navigating college in circumstances similar to his own, to create tools and resources that could make the difference between dropping out and graduating. The money was appealing, but it was not the primary motivation, and accepting it would have required abandoning the mission for financial reward. Marcus had already achieved more financial security than he had ever expected, was earning a CEO salary that allowed him to live comfortably and save substantially, had equity in a growing company that would eventually provide meaningful wealth, whether or not he sold. The additional wealth from acquisition was not worth the cost of losing control over something that mattered more than money. The decision to remain independent meant continuing to grow through a combination of revenue and strategic investment, continuing to navigate the tensions between mission and financial optimization, continuing to prove that it was possible to build a valuable company while maintaining values and priorities that many investors thought were incompatible with success. It was a harder path than selling would have been, required more sustained effort and more difficult choices, but it was the path that felt aligned with why Marcus had started the company in the first place. Over the following 3 years, Pathways continued expanding, reaching 500 universities, growing revenue to $50 million annually, and achieving consistent profitability. The company raised one additional funding round, a $20 million Series B from impact investors who shared Marcus's commitment to educational equity and who were willing to accept lower financial returns in exchange for measurable social impact. The funding allowed Pathways to invest in new product lines, to expand internationally, and to build partnerships with community-based organizations that served students outside traditional university systems. By the time Marcus was 35, 10 years after graduating from college, Pathways was valued at $500 million based on a revenue multiple that reflected both its financial performance and its market position as the dominant platform in the student success technology category. Marcus owned 40% of the company, a stake worth $200 million on paper, and he had built an organization that employed 200 people and served more than 2 million students across 600 institutions. The success was remarkable by any measure, represented a journey from homelessness to wealth that seemed almost implausible, validated every sacrifice and difficult choice Marcus had made along the way. But the success also sat uncomfortably alongside Marcus's awareness of how exceptional his path had been, how many factors beyond his control had needed to align for this outcome to be possible, How many other people with equal intelligence and work ethic and determination would never have similar opportunities because the barriers they faced were insurmountable? Marcus thought often about the other students he had known, who had aged out of foster care, who had tried to navigate college without resources or support, who had not made it to graduation, or who had graduated but could not find employment, or who had found employment but could not achieve financial stability. He thought about the students currently sleeping in their cars at Georgia State and at hundreds of other universities, students who were using pathways to navigate resources, but who still faced enormous structural barriers to success. And he thought about what responsibility came with his own success, what obligations he had to use his wealth and platform and influence to create more pathways for others. He started by creating a foundation, the Pathways Foundation, funded with $5 million of his own money, and focused on supporting students who were experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity while in college. The foundation provided direct cash assistance, emergency grants of $500 to $5,000 that students could use for housing deposits or emergency expenses or basic needs, no strings attached, and with minimal application requirements. The model was based on research showing that small amounts of money at critical moments could be the difference between students staying enrolled versus dropping out, that emergency assistance was often more effective than traditional support programs with extensive requirements and restrictions. The foundation also funded scholarships specifically for students aging out of foster care, providing not just tuition support, but comprehensive wraparound services including housing assistance and mental health counseling and mentorship and career preparation. Marcus had learned from his own experience that academic ability was not the primary barrier for foster youth in college, that the real barriers were lack of support systems and resources and knowledge about navigating institutional structures. The scholarships were designed to address these barriers holistically rather than just providing financial aid. And Marcus used his platform as a successful entrepreneur to advocate for policy changes that would address systemic barriers to college access and success. He testified before state legislatures about extending foster care support beyond age 18, about providing housing assistance for college students experiencing homelessness, about reforming financial aid systems to better serve independent students without family support. He wrote op-eds and gave interviews and spoke at conferences, using his own story strategically, while also emphasizing that individual success stories should not distract from the need for structural change. The advocacy work was time-consuming and often frustrating, involved engaging with policymakers who were sympathetic but constrained by budgets and political realities, who wanted simple solutions to complex problems, who sometimes used Marcus's story to avoid addressing underlying systems. But Marcus persisted because he understood that Pathways and the Foundation could help thousands of students but could not address the millions who faced similar challenges. That meaningful change required policy and structural reform alongside individual and organizational interventions. Some of Marcus's employees and investors questioned why he was spending time on advocacy and philanthropy rather than focusing exclusively on growing the company, why he was using his personal wealth for the foundation rather than investing it back into Pathways or enjoying the financial security he had earned. The questions reflected different values and priorities, assumptions that business success was the primary measure of achievement, that wealth should be accumulated and enjoyed rather than redistributed, that Marcus's obligations were to shareholders and employees rather than to the broader community of students facing challenges he had faced. Marcus understood these perspectives, but did not share them. He had built Pathways because of his own experience with educational barriers, had always understood the company as a tool for addressing systemic problems rather than just as a vehicle for personal wealth creation. The fact that the company had become financially successful did not change its core purpose, did not mean that Marcus's priorities should shift from mission to profit maximization. And the wealth he had accumulated was not something he felt entitled to enjoy, without consideration of how and why he had been able to accumulate it when so many others in similar circumstances had not. If you have followed Marcus Williams's journey from sleeping in his car during college to building a $500 million company, and if you recognize in his choices and his values something worth emulating or supporting, consider how you might use whatever resources or influence or platform you possess towards similar ends. The work of creating more equitable pathways to success requires not just celebrating individuals who achieve against the odds, but changing the systems that create those odds in the first place. At 37, Marcus stepped back from day-to-day operations at Pathways, transitioning to executive chairman while hiring an experienced CEO to manage the company's continued growth. The new CEO was a Latina woman named Carmen Diaz, who had spent 15 years in education technology leadership at major companies and who shared Marcus's commitment to mission-driven growth. Carmen brought operational expertise and industry relationships that complemented Marcus's product vision and lived experience, and together they structured a leadership arrangement that allowed Marcus to remain involved in strategy and culture while delegating management responsibilities. The transition freed Marcus to spend more time on the foundation and on advocacy work, to be more deliberate about how he used his influence and resources. He funded research on homelessness among college students, supported policy campaigns for housing assistance, and extended foster care support, invested in other entrepreneurs from marginalized backgrounds who were building companies addressing social problems. And he remained visible as someone who had succeeded despite systemic barriers, rather than because of systemic advantages, who used his platform to highlight structural inequities rather than to promote narratives of individual meritocracy. Marcus also reconnected with his own past in ways he had avoided during the years of intense focus on building the company. He returned to Georgia State, not as a struggling student sleeping in his car, but as a donor and advocate, funding scholarships and emergency assistance programs and improvements to student services. He visited the group home where he had lived as a teenager, talking with current residents about their aspirations and their challenges, trying to provide encouragement and resources and connections that might help them navigate paths he had navigated alone. And he allowed himself, for the first time since sleeping in his car, to experience something approaching rest, to live without the constant anxiety about financial precarity, to make choices based on values and interests rather than survival necessity. He bought a house in Atlanta, nothing ostentatious but comfortable and secure, the first space that felt genuinely like home after decades of temporary housing and shelters and cars and cramped apartments. He traveled, visiting countries and experiencing cultures that had been abstractions when he was younger. He dated, allowing himself vulnerability and connection that he had not felt safe pursuing when his life was consumed by survival and building. But Marcus also carried awareness that his success was exceptional rather than representative, that most people who experienced homelessness while in college did not build $500 million companies, that structural barriers were not overcome through individual determination alone, but through collective action and systemic change. His story was real and meaningful and worth telling, but it was not a template that others could simply follow, was not evidence that the system worked for people who worked hard enough. The students currently sleeping in their cars at universities across the country, the young people aging out of foster care without support or resources, the individuals navigating poverty and discrimination and institutional indifference, they needed more than inspiration from Marcus's success. They needed housing assistance and financial aid reform, and extended support systems and employment opportunities, and a society that valued their potential rather than treating them as problems to be managed. Marcus's story demonstrated that such potential existed, that intelligence and creativity and determination were not the exclusive property of people from privileged backgrounds, but realizing that potential required changing the conditions that made Marcus's path so difficult and so exceptional. He continued telling his story, continued being public about his experience with homelessness and foster care and the barriers he had faced building Pathways. But he was intentional about how he told it, about framing his success as evidence of systemic failure rather than systemic success, about emphasizing that the existence of exceptions did not validate the rule. He challenged narratives that celebrated individual achievement while ignoring structural injustice, that treated poverty as a failure of character rather than as a failure of policy, that asked why everyone could not be like Marcus Williams rather than asking why anyone should have to sleep in their car to finish college. The work continued, as it always did, the slow, incremental effort to change systems and institutions and cultural narratives. Marcus used his wealth to fund that work, used his platform to amplify it, used his experience to inform it, and he remained connected to the reality that had shaped him, continued understanding himself as someone who had survived poverty and homelessness, rather than as someone who had escaped them, continued feeling responsibility to those who were currently navigating circumstances he had navigated and who deserved better than the circumstances allowed. At 40, Marcus had spent nearly half his life building pathways, had transformed a class project developed while sleeping in his car into a company serving millions of students and valued at more than $500 million. The company had become sustainable and successful, had achieved both financial returns and social impact, had demonstrated that it was possible to build valuable enterprises while maintaining commitment to equity and mission. Carmen was leading the company's continued growth, and Marcus remained involved in strategy and culture, while focusing primarily on the foundation and policy work. The Pathways Foundation had distributed more than $50 million in emergency assistance and scholarships over the previous 5 years, had helped thousands of students stay enrolled who might otherwise have dropped out, had funded research and advocacy that contributed to policy changes in several states. The impact was measurable and meaningful, but Marcus remained aware that it was modest relative to the scale of need. That thousands of students helped was a fraction of the millions who faced similar challenges. He thought about scale constantly, about how to multiply impact, about whether directing resources toward direct assistance was more effective than directing them toward systemic change. The Foundation's emergency grants helped individual students immediately, but did not change the underlying conditions that created emergencies. The policy advocacy could potentially change systems, but was slow and uncertain and depended on political contexts beyond Marcus's control. The challenge was determining how to allocate limited resources for maximum long-term impact, while also responding to immediate needs. Marcus had no definitive answers, only the commitment to continue trying, to use what he had built and what he had learned toward making pathways to success slightly less difficult for those who came after him. He knew his impact would be limited, that one person's wealth and one foundation's resources and one company's mission were insufficient to address systemic poverty and educational inequity. But he also knew that limited impact was better than no impact, that incremental progress was better than resignation, that using privilege and platform toward justice was better than using them only toward personal comfort. The story that had begun with Marcus sleeping in his car at Georgia State, surviving on determination and discipline and Walmart parking lots, had evolved into something he could never have imagined during those nights when graduation seemed impossibly distant and stability seemed like a fantasy. He had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had achieved wealth that seemed absurd given his starting point, had created a platform that served millions of students and employed hundreds of people and contributed meaningfully to educational equity. But Marcus understood that his story was not primarily about individual achievement or bootstrapping or meritocracy. It was about the waste of human potential that resulted from systemic barriers, about how many Marcus Williamses never got the chance to build companies or pursue their goals because poverty and housing insecurity and lack of support made survival itself an all-consuming challenge. It was about how success against the odds should prompt questions about why the odds are structured as they are, about who benefits from maintaining barriers, about what society loses when talent is systematically excluded. And it was about the responsibility that came with achieving success despite systemic barriers rather than because of systemic advantages, about how that success obligated him to work toward changing the conditions that made his path so exceptional, about how wealth and platform could be used toward justice or toward insulation, and either choice had consequences that extended beyond his individual life. Marcus Williams had slept in his car to finish college. He had built a company worth $500 million, and now he was using what he had built to ensure that fewer people would need to sleep in their cars, to access education, to create more pathways to success, to challenge the systems that made extraordinary effort necessary for ordinary opportunity. The work continued, as it would for the rest of his life, because building something valuable did not mean the building was finished, because success did not eliminate obligation, because the journey that had started in a parking deck at Georgia State was really a journey toward creating conditions where such parking deck nights would become unnecessary rather than inevitable. That was the story, complex and ongoing and irreducible to simple inspiration narratives. That was the reality, shaped by systemic forces and individual choices and contingent circumstances and persistent effort. That was the challenge extended to anyone encountering this account, to recognize it not as a template for individual advancement, but as an indictment of systems that make advancement unnecessarily difficult, and to act accordingly with whatever resources and influence they possess toward creating more just and equitable conditions for all.